Is the genocide finally over? 2 years of daily depravity, every war crime, every crime against humanity imaginable committed by the Israeli state, armed and facilitated by the West. Well, now the first phase of a ceasefire deal, which is supposed to be or billed as a permanent end to the war, has been agreed. That is obviously after negotiations with Israel, Hamas, and this is known as the Trump peace deal and all the rest of it. Now, there's been scenes of jubilation in Gaza, understandably, a traumatized, starved people who've suffered unimaginable horror. But is this really over? What happens next? What does this actually mean in practice? There's no better person to speak to, as I'm sure many of you will know, having listened so many times to him and read what he said throughout the genocide. A crucial voice is Mohammed Shehada, who is the absolutely fantastic, incredible Palestinian analyst who's, of course, from Gaza. Firstly, great to see you.
No, thanks so much, my friend.
I just want to start by asking, let's just firstly, with what's been agreed, is there, because the way when it first emerged was it wasn't a peace deal, it was a ultimatum, essentially, take it or leave it, or we will let rip. And Israel. Sorry, the US made clear Israel could just do what it wanted. Do you think is this any different from what was actually agreed or presented in the first place?
Well, I think first thought is I'm not sure. Nobody is sure. Hamas until now is asking for guarantees that the war would not be resumed, that the genocide is over. They asked for an official declaration from either Trump or the Israelis that there would be an end to the war. Otherwise, they said they would not engage in the prisoner swap, the release of captives, and getting Palestinians in return. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that they did manage to introduce some changes into the parameters of the Trump deal, at least in the areas that were not so controversial. The rest of the deal, they left until a later stage. Hopefully, it'll never happen in the first place. Like the thing with the border peace, Trump, Blair, Sharm el-Sheikh, Dubai, Qatar, all of these mega ambitious ideas. They were like, nah, thanks. Let's wait with these until a later date. So they dealt with the essence of the deal, which is the end of the war, the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the release of Palestinian hostages, the release of Israeli hostages, and the introduction of aid on a massive scale to people in Gaza. With the withdrawal, you saw the Trump map in his plan, which was basically 10 times worse what Netanyahu had offered Hamas in July for a partial deal. Netanyahu at the time said, give me only 10 of the captives you have at the moment, and I will withdraw out of over 70% of Gaza. In the Trump plan, it shows Israel holding over 57% of Gaza. So Netanyahu almost doubled the area that he wanted to keep. Hamas managed to sort of maneuver around that withdrawal line, change it a bit here and there, make an opening for the Rafah border crossing so that to wrestle the control over aid from Israel's hands and put it in the hands of Arab countries, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, and other countries as well, that would try to introduce aid to Gaza on scale and that would try to be on the ground in Gaza. These countries are planning to enter Gaza as soon as there's a ceasefire and try to be on the ground. So that's one thing. The other thing that they managed to work on was the issue of the identities, the names of Palestinian captives, prisoners, and hostages that would be released. So Hamas gave the Israelis a long list of Palestinians that they would like to swap for the Israeli captives that they are holding at the moment. They're still waiting for a response from the Israeli side. Basically, Trump rushed and declared a deal before there was a deal. And his first thought in mind, you cannot read his mind, of course, but the first intuition is that he wanted to announce a deal in time for the Nobel Peace Prize that he's very desperate for, only because Obama got one. And when Obama got it, he got it sort of like in advance as a sign of goodwill from the Nobel Committee to beg him to stop killing brown and black people. And of course, he didn't commit to that. But you have Trump in the same mentality that he's hoping to get a gift, a prize that would basically equalize Obama's legacy, etc. So that's the first thing. But once you have Trump announcing that there is a deal, it can actually create a lot of pressure and momentum inside Israel and Netanyahu to compromise on a lot of things last minute. And that's at least the hope. Is it a guarantee? No. Qatar and the US guaranteed to Hamas that the ceasefire will hold and that Israel would not violate it. But from the moment that the ceasefire was announced, Israel actually intensified the genocide in Gaza. They've been bombing it relentlessly. It's like they're rushing super fast to get as much destruction and killing done before their hands get tied. Only moments ago, I was watching TV, and on camera, you saw Israeli tanks bombing Palestinians on the beach as they were walking, trying to get back to their homes. So, this is number one. Number two is, even if a deal goes through and an end to the genocide is declared, and mediators manage to enforce the ceasefire and manage to force Netanyahu into a corner, there's no guarantee that it would hold. Israel will do everything possible to sabotage the deal even after it goes into effect. It's like, it's not only one deja vu, but it's at least a dozen of these. I've lived through 10 Israeli military operations, high-tech killing sprees, 3 wars, 2 grand invasions. And each time it ended with the same way: Israel signing on an agreement that pledges an end to the siege on Gaza. And as soon as the agreement is signed, everybody forgets what the agreement was about, and Israel gets to do whatever it wants. The last thing is that you have all of those Israeli proxy gangs in Gaza, some of them linked to ISIS very explicitly, Abu Shabab, etc. And those gangs are very terrified about their future in the case of a ceasefire, because the IDF, Israel, used them so much. They've been using those gangs to loot the overwhelming majority of aid. They used those gangs as human shields. They would send them into combat areas before Israeli soldiers. They used them as mercenaries to go to murder, kill, kidnap their fellow Palestinians. And now when those gangs asked Israel for guarantees that their security would be maintained, Israel did not provide them with any. So some of those gangs, were seeing them disintegrating and unraveling, like Abu Shabab. I just heard about 5 members from that gang turning themselves into Hamas. But those gangs would have a vested interest into destabilizing the ceasefire with whatever way they could, firing at Israeli troops, launching mortar shells from inside Gaza, or they would be controlled by their Israeli handlers in the Shin Bet in the army, who would ask them to go and sabotage the ceasefire and give Israel a pretext to resume the genocide. Herzi Halevi, who was the former IDF chief of staff, I think at some point he said something to Netanyahu like, go ahead, sign a deal, because it wouldn't be very difficult for us to manufacture a pretext and resume the genocide again. It's just as plain and simple as that. So everybody that I've spoken to this morning is not feeling optimistic. There's no feeling of joy or relief. It's rather the sentiment of, I'll only believe it when I see it. And not only when I see it for the next year minimum.
Before I ask about going forward, the Israeli hostage negotiator Gershon Baskin said, what we should know is that this deal could have been done a long time ago. Hamas agreed to all of the same terms in September 2024 in what became known as a 3 weeks deal that I had received in writing and voice message in Arabic and in English. But at that point, the response of the Israeli negotiators was that the prime minister did not agree to end the war. And even the New York Times, which has been dire in its coverage of the genocide, wrote a detailed investigative long piece about how Netanyahu deliberately dragged out the genocide and the repeated sabotaging. Obviously, well, we saw the sabotaging the ceasefire deal early this year when Israel just unilaterally broke it and then imposed a total siege. But they've done that all the way through. I mean, what do you make of that? What he says, that actually, what the terms that were being offered had already been agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just this. So Gershon here is talking about a proposal that Hamas delivered to him. Ghazi Hamad, the Hamas leader, gave him around that time, pledging to release all Israeli captives immediately and get the war done within only 3 weeks, with the Israeli withdrawal, with the end to the war, with Hamas stepping down from power, handing over the governance of Gaza to another administrative, technocratic, apolitical committee. All of these parameters that later on formed the Trump initiative. But it's not only this. Since December 2023, so the 3rd month into the genocide, Hamas pledged to do all of those things already. We know that on the 2nd day of the genocide, on October 8th, October 9th, Hamas delivered a message to Israel through mediators that it was ready to release all Israeli captives immediately, unconditionally, given that Israel would not launch a genocide inside Gaza, that it would suspend its invasion, its military operations and bombing. And then Hamas, by December, they told the mediators that they are committed to stepping down from ruling Gaza once and for all, that they would have zero role whatsoever to play in government. So that's why you had The Qatari prime minister, when the ceasefire was announced in January this year, I think he went on CNN and he said the deal that was signed just now has been the same deal on the table since December 2023. Israel wasted over a year in maneuvers, in sort of like mental gymnastics. But the thing is, Netanyahu, throughout the entire genocide, has been only using the facade of negotiations to buy time for the genocide itself, with the full knowledge and complicity of his partners, whether Joe Biden or now Trump. So I've seen it play before my eyes in those like sort of meetings with foreign ministries in Europe, etc., contact groups, where they would bring people from Biden's White House or Trump's White House, and they would tell the exact same message, that please, please, please don't pressure Israel at all. Don't even publicly criticize them. Because if you criticize Israel in the mildest terms, Hamas would become more hardline, Hamas would become more uncompromising, and Hamas will refuse to sign a deal that ends the war. There's a ceasefire deal around the corner, and if we keep up the pressure on Hamas, they will sign. That was the talking point. It was insanely dumb. It was pathetic. Every time I called it out, it with such ease, because it doesn't take much to dismantle it. It's pure propaganda. But European governments, they bought into this immediately because it was a very convenient cover. But what you have now is Trump basically, after the bombing of Doha, after Israel bombed Doha, Trump needed to repay the Qataris in one way or another. And one repayment was the security guarantees that Trump signed in an executive order. The other was the deal in Gaza. That's what the Qataris were asking for. And you had basically Arab governments as well as Turkey. You had Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, etc., and the Turkish government meeting with Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly and trying to pressure him into getting a deal done with Gaza. And that's the picture that you have at hand now, is basically, is the Trump deal perfect? Absolutely not. It's like a bizarre mix of colonialism, new liberalism, capitalism, some sort of dystopia, where Trump is going to be the supreme leader of Gaza and the United States, and possibly soon Greenland and Panama as well. But it's basically, it was a starting point, and that's how Hamas understood it. That's how mediators persuaded Hamas to respond in the way that it responded. The response that Hamas gave was co-drafted by a number of Arab governments, Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, and individuals who advised them on the legal formulation, on the sort of symbolic, on like every part of the response that Hamas delivered. And the answer that they gave was not, your deal is garbage. Or it was not also, yes, we agree to this, but we don't agree to this. No, they said, yes, we agree to ending the war, the withdrawal of the Israelis from Gaza, the prisoner swap, and the other parts of the deal. We would like to discuss it. We would love to hear your thoughts, Supreme Leader, Mr. President, on these other parts of your deal later on, at some point in the indefinite future, because we need other Palestinians to join into the discussion, because we don't have the mandate to decide the entire future of Palestinians. And they were advised to release that response on the evening of Friday, because it would be Holy Shabbat, the day where most lunatics in Israel would not have access to their cell phones or to the internet or to any modern technology because of Shabbat. So their answer would be delayed. And then you had the Jewish holidays coming after, that sort of contained the pushback from Israel against the deal. So the Israeli propaganda machinery was not in full force when Hamas answered. And that's how you get to this moment where basically Trump prematurely declared that there is major progress. He declared that there is a deal. And now he's not going to be a child and say, no, all of it collapsed and I'm to blame for all of this. He's going to try to pressure Netanyahu and Hamas and Arab governments and Turkey, etc., to get the deal done as soon as possible. So that's the best hope that we have at the moment.
I mean, just talking about the continued Israeli atrocities, as you mentioned, for example, civilians on the beach trying to get home and being attacked by an Israeli tank. And have just seen, for example, Motasem Adalul, a Palestinian journalist. So many of his family have already been murdered. His wife, many of his children. And he's posted, Israeli occupation forces have just killed my third son, Ibrahim. RIP, my dear son. Just one example of the fact that, as we're speaking and talking about, is the genocide over, people are being murdered. But that point, I mean, that's, I guess, the question going forward, knowing everything we know about Israel is, and the sticking point has been, well, if Hamas, when they release their hostages, then there's nothing to stop Israel resuming the genocide with full force, and the issue has been, what guarantees are there to prevent that from happening, which they would then agree to? I mean, do you think, would it be a case of Donald Trump clearly has just decided this is not sustainable for geopolitical reasons, collapsing support for Israel at home, including amongst his MAGA base, that kind of thing. But what do you think? Is that the guarantees? Basically, Trump has said, "I'm fed up of this. That I don't, I've this, but no more." What do you think about in terms of guarantees about this? In terms of going forward, what Israel does?
Well, basically, it was a debate inside Hamas recently, and inside amongst Palestinians in general, whether keeping Israeli captives in Gaza was worth it anymore, if it has become a burden or if it's still a card of pressure. Like the main reason why Hamas took captives on October 7th, according to Israel itself, according to Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, was because Hamas wanted to negotiate an end to Israel's illegal occupation. So Yoav Gallant is saying they took captives to force us to end our illegal occupation, to force us to leave Jerusalem, to negotiate a two-state solution, to negotiate leaving the West Bank. But the sort of more immediate reason was to hold them as an insurance card. Again, according to Israel itself, according to Yoav Gallant, the insurance card that Israel would leave Gaza, that Israel would end the genocide in Gaza. But at this stage, what you saw is basically the card of the maintaining captives in Gaza was not creating sufficient pressure in Israel. There was a lot of pressure from the families, a lot from the opposition. There was pressure around the world, in Europe, in the US, etc., on Netanyahu to do a deal. But he very easily maneuvered all of these sort of like different forces that were pressuring him. So that became the debate. Should we release them? Have they become a burden? But then, like, the mentality is if there are no longer Israeli captives in Gaza, it would take away Israel's main pretext, at least the formal one, for the genocide. So that would sort of encourage more Western governments to speak up against the genocide in Gaza. So that's at least the ideal case scenario. But Palestinians understand that it's not the shortage of excuses that would push Western officials to denounce the genocide. They are completely complicit. They will find another lame excuse. They would say, well, Israel has the right to guarantee that Hamas would not do another October 7th. Although any serious Israeli analyst would tell you the chances of another October 7th are zero, because what enabled it was the element of surprise, Israel being caught with their pants down. So the chance of this happening again is zero, unless Israel's army is such incompetent imbeciles that they would just allow it to happen all over again. But the chance is minimal. But basically, they would say, Western governments would say, Israel has the right to carry out, to continue the operations in Gaza until Hamas surrenders, until Hamas disarms, until this and this and that. So they will find new excuses. That's the understanding. But what you have basically right now, so it's neither a sufficient card of pressure to keep them, nor is it a sufficient card of pressure to release them. Instead, in the middle is the Hamas demand that you need a formal declaration from Trump or from Israel that there is an end to the war as soon as the agreement is signed, before any Israeli captives are released. But that is not sufficient. There's also the guarantees that Trump, Qatar, and other mediators gave Hamas, but it's also not sufficient. We know those guarantees are worth basically nothing, because last time there were guarantees with the January ceasefire, when Netanyahu decided to bomb the ceasefire into smithereens, what you had is basically the European Union coming out and condemning Hamas for Netanyahu collapsing the ceasefire. That was literally the statement. We strongly condemn Hamas for refusing to indulge in Netanyahu's whatever. So we expect a similar dynamic. But the thing, like, there's an element of maximizing the plausibility of the ceasefire holding. That's one element. There's no guarantee that it will hold. The other element is basically making it logistically difficult for Israel to resume the genocide again. So there is the understanding amongst mediators and in Hamas that if the ceasefire holds for 60 days or more, if they get it to 90 days, 120 days, then it would be more difficult for the IDF to remobilize their troops again. They would have to take some time, month or 2 or 3, which would give enough time to recreate the pressure on Israel to stop. There's this one element. The other element is to introduce massive aid to Gaza on scale to prevent societal collapse, to sort of like counter the famine that Israel created in Gaza. So what you have at the moment is a guarantee in the round of negotiations that was just finalized in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, that Israel would open 5 border crossings with Gaza, not just Kerem Shalom, not just Zekim/Erez, but there would be 5 border crossings. And one of them is the Rafah border crossing with Egypt to sort of like take away Israel's control over aid, put it in the hands of UN agencies, the Red Cross and Arab countries. There's also an Arab push to introduce aid to Gaza by sea so that they can bring it on scale including housing units, caravans, prefabricated homes, etc. So it's just to like bolster the Palestinian steadfastness, resilience on the ground. The last element is that Hamas is at a point where they have nothing to lose anymore. So even if the genocide is resumed, there's nothing left for Israel to bomb. They've been at it for over 2 years now. They failed to crush Hamas militarily. So what is it that they're going to do differently that would lead to the defeat of Hamas if the hostages are out or if the hostages are in? There's not much of a difference. The insurgency, Hamas can maintain it very easily for a very long time because it doesn't take much. An insurgency is basically one person here with a Kalashnikov, one person there with an anti-tank missile. They're sort of ambushing, awaiting very patiently for the IDF to fall into an ambush. They're awaiting in tunnels in hibernation mode. They come out, engage with the IDF, go back in the tunnels and disappear. It doesn't take a lot of troops to do an insurgency. At the same time, that's the sort of like the silver lining, is that from Israel's point of view, Hamas has ceased to be a threat to Israel itself, not to the IDF, but to Israel itself, since at least February 2024. I've heard the same intelligence assessment in the US, in Canada, around Europe, etc. They say Hamas ceased to be a threat to Israel since February 2024. But what they mean by that is that Hamas ran out of rockets. They ran out of these improvised, homemade projectiles, unguided projectiles that they create in Gaza from scratch by recycling Israeli unexploded ordnance. And they don't have many of these anymore. And they don't have the will to fire them, even if they have some of it, because they don't want to give Israel a pretext to prolong the genocide. So it ceased to be a threat to Israel. But it does remain a major threat to Israel's occupation of Gaza. As long as there is a single soldier inside Gaza, the insurgency will remain, because the presence of genocidal forces inside a besieged cage is the biggest recruitment poster for people to join the armed struggle against those occupiers.
Well, exactly. Look, I just want to quote Bezalel Smotrich. He's often described as the far right finance minister for those who I'm sure are familiar with him, but I mean, they're all genocidal, racist extremists, but he's seen as particularly extreme. He said, a tremendous responsibility to ensure that this is not, God forbid, a deal of hostages in exchange for stopping the war, as Hamas thinks and boasts, even if under better starting conditions than what was previously offered to us, and that immediately after the hostages return home, the state of Israel will continue to strive with all its might for the true eradication of Hamas, the genuine disarmament of Gaza, so that it no longer poses a threat to Israel. Now, one of the dynamics in the genocide, of course, is that Benjamin Netanyahu faces trial for corruption, and it's been in his interest for that reason to drag this out, and therefore, because as soon as he is no longer prime minister, then he's legally vulnerable, and therefore depends on Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the two most extreme elements in the Israeli government, and so a lot of people would look at that and think, well, what's happened before? I mean, Smotrich basically just got what he's wanted all the way through. I mean, this was happening, for example, during the assault on Rafah back in April 2024. Again, when a peace deal was presented, all the rest of it, and Smotrich demanded it, didn't happen, and Netanyahu just went along with it. So I guess people look at it and think, what do you think about that dynamic? Because otherwise you kind of think, well, the Netanyahu government will collapse unless Smotrich is seen to get his way, and then others would go, well, that won't happen, and therefore that's why they think this will all collapse, because if Smotrich is saying that, then that shows the Israeli government under his pressure will just go back to where it was. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the understanding in Hamas and amongst Palestinians that Netanyahu will try everything possible to collapse the deal once he gets the Israeli captives back. That is a very clear understanding. But they see now sort of like shifting dynamics and momentum in Washington, in the Arab world, where there's this concerted effort to pressure Israel to end the genocide. The problem is that in Washington, in the White House, you have a lot of forces pushing in the opposite direction. You have Witkoff, Jared Kushner, you have Marco Rubio, all the lunatics, all the messianic extremists who want Israel to continue whatever it wants, whether it's genocide, whether it's annexation of the West Bank. And Trump always listens to the last person in the room. So you never know. It's like a throw of the dice. What you have basically with Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, is there a major threat of them withdrawing from government? This has been the talking point for the last 2 years, of saying that Netanyahu cannot end the genocide in Gaza because then Smotrich Ben-Gvir will leave the government. His government will collapse. He'll end up in prison. I don't think so. I don't think it's the case. And I've spoken to a number of knowledgeable people about this who know this better than me with Israeli domestic politics. And the impression that I have is basically Netanyahu, of course, needs them, but they need him as well. Smotrich, in every single poll in Israel that's conducted about the future elections, Smotrich doesn't even pass the threshold to remain in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. He gets way below the threshold necessary to have a single seat for his party at the parliament, which means he needs to stay in this coalition until his numbers improve. Ben Gvir, he kept threatening Netanyahu that he's going to leave government, he's going to leave government. And when the first ceasefire was signed and the second ceasefire was signed, what you had is basically Ben Gvir leaving the government temporarily without leaving the coalition, which means there was still government in Israel. It still enjoyed majority support in the parliament. You had something similar with the Israeli ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredim. What you had there is basically they wanted to be exempted from the draft, from recruitment, conscription into the IDF. And they wanted Netanyahu to pass a law explicitly exempting them because they spend their time studying the Torah, and they consider that studying the Torah qualifies as military duty because they should qualify as the division in the IDF that's protecting soldiers by praying for them to carry the genocide with greater efficiency. So that was the logic. And Netanyahu failed to pass that law through the Knesset, although he tried repeatedly. He had members from his party, from other parties that were not playing along with this. So the ultra-Orthodox gave him an ultimatum that they were going to leave government and the coalition. And the ultimatum came to pass. And they did leave government and they left the coalition. But they said, we're not going to collapse the government. Because they also know that if the government collapses, Netanyahu's numbers in the polls at the moment and his entire coalition are foretelling of him only getting about 50 seats out of 120. He's still 11 seats short to form a government if there's elections that are held today or tomorrow. And he tried everything. He tried to kill Nasrallah, Ismail Haniyeh, to bomb Iran, to bomb Qatar, to do all of those like grand gestures, kill the Sinwar, kill the other Sinwar, and it did not improve his numbers in the polls. So all of his coalition partners are basically held hostage to the dwindling numbers of their coalition in the polls. So they don't have any interest to collapse the government, even if the genocide is ended in Gaza. It's more about legacy shaping. Netanyahu it's often said that he's trying to like draw comparisons between himself and Winston Churchill. You saw the speech that he gave, this dumb, imbecilic speech about Sparta. We are the Sparta of the world. You had another speech about that we will keep fighting even if the US cuts off all the weapons. When Biden suspended the 2,000-pound bombs as a symbolic gesture, he's like, yeah, we're going to keep fighting even if we fight with our nails. And it's completely imbecilic. But there's an Israeli general called Giora Island. That's the guy that introduced the idea of mass starvation, famine, and spread of disease in Gaza as weapons of war. And Giora Island basically said that Netanyahu doesn't want to be remembered as Churchill. He wants to be remembered as FDR, a president or a leader that presided over a major catastrophe like Pearl Harbor or October 7th, but managed to undo it by achieving a greater victory. And from an Israeli perspective, the destruction of Gaza is not a victory. The expansion of Israel is the victory. Greater Israel is the victory. So he wants to be remembered in that way, that he's the Israeli leader that managed to finish off the Palestinian question, that managed to expand Israel's borders. And he's not going to relent. Like, even if there's a ceasefire that's signed, even if the war is over, it's very easy for Israel to manufacture a pretext to resume the genocide. As I said earlier, the road to this genocide is paved with countless ceasefire agreements. Ehud Barak, who was Israel's prime minister and then minister of defense and now entangled with the whole Epstein files, Ehud Barak said once something like, sign a ceasefire deal in Gaza no matter what, because once the deal goes into force, nobody bothers about the details. You can do whatever you want. And that's the Israeli dynamic. Like every time they signed a deal in Gaza, it didn't take long after until they were bombing Gaza again. 2008, that's basically when Israel had signed a ceasefire agreement with Hamas about 4 or 5 months prior, and then decided to bomb the hell out of Gaza unprovoked, without any notice, without any reason whatsoever, no pretext at the time. They just decided to go at it. 2012, Israel bombed Gaza and killed the top Hamas leader called Ahmed Jabari. The headline in Haaretz, the Israeli mainstream liberal newspaper, was, "We killed our subcontractor in Gaza." So why did Israel see him as a subcontractor? Because on the day that Israel took him out, he was literally on his way to sign a permanent ceasefire deal with the Israelis. So they're not going to relent. 2014 as well, there was a reconciliation agreement in Gaza between Hamas and Fatah, Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, that would have seen Hamas step down from government. All the talk right now about Hamas ending its rule in Gaza, they signed on this in 2014, 11 years ago, and the agreement went through and the government was formed, and Ismail Haniyeh stepped down from being the prime minister at the time. What you had is basically Netanyahu immediately bombing the hell out of Gaza to sabotage and collapse that agreement. And so on. You have it over and over and over again. It's not going to be the lack of pretext that will stop Netanyahu from finishing off the Palestinian question. It is the global complicity, the sort of convenience of hiding behind pretexts and fancy words and whatever excuses that they've been throwing at us for the last 2 years.
I want to ask you just a couple of final things. And one is the question of accountability. We've seen live streamed a genocide. One of the worst crimes of our age, limitless barbarity, limitless depravity. Any war crime that is imaginable has been committed against children, babies, pregnant women, elderly people, and men and boys who also have the right to live, who've been exterminated. Gaza has been wiped from the face of the earth. The most systematic industrialized obliteration of a territory in human history. Are people deliberately starved? We could go on. The destruction of hospitals, medics, a reminder of the capacity that humans have for depravity without erasing the dynamic here, which is of a genocidal occupier against the occupied. The International Criminal Court, of course, has issued arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, for crimes against humanity and war crimes, centered mostly on starvation, but other charges are believed to have been on the way, though they won't be publicly declared now because they have now been done secretly. And the International Criminal, there's also the South Africa's case of genocide in the International Court of Justice. Now, it was mooted that part of the Trump deal was that Palestinians would abandon attempts to get legal accountability for the genocide that has been perpetrated against them. What do you make of that? I mean, do you think now we could, someone's suggesting, I took talk of, could the International Criminal Court retract its arrest warrants, that kind of thing? I mean, there's already been the sanctioning of the whole court by the United States courts. What do you think about that in terms of what happens next, in terms of what this could all mean for accountability?
Well, with the International Criminal Court, yes, they do have a principle in which, in theory, they would drop the charges against Netanyahu and Gallant as sort of a goodwill gesture to facilitate peacemaking. All that Israel would have to do is to pretend to engage in a peace process, so-called. We've been through a lot of these. It never led to anything other than way more settlers have been moved into the West Bank during the peace process than before. So all it would take is the pretext of peace process for the ICC to come out and say, okay, in the spirit of peacemaking, we're going to drop the charges. Yes, in theory, they have that kind of principle. And they're very likely to do this. People at the ICC are basically human. They're very terrified of the sanctions. Some of them would capitulate. Some of them would sell out. The hope is that there are enough forces at the ICC to prevent this, and that we can maintain the global momentum that Gaza had earned throughout the genocide after the bombing stops. It's a really major challenge. How do you keep the cameras on? How do you keep the discourse on the Israeli apartheid system once the bombing stops? Because it is sort of like the spectacular nature of violence that drew the attention in the first place, the famine, the brutalization of children. And once you have that stopped, Israel will continue the violence in other less visible ways, preventing reconstruction, maintaining blockade, raids in and out of the West Bank, in and out of Gaza, surgical bombings here and there, massacres from time to another that would draw less attention. So it's a big challenge. How do you maintain that momentum? The best way to maintain it is basically the thing that I try to keep telling people in Europe or in the US is, we as Palestinians don't look at us only as victims or as oppressed people. Look at us as canaries in a coal mine. We're screaming of a major warning of what's about to come your way. When you have a media political class that's relishing, delighting in the murder of our children, do you think they're going to care about yours? When you have all of those tools that have been experimented on us throughout the genocide for 2 years, population crowd control, starvation, testing the limits, like Gaza was turned into the most major experimental zone in human history, testing how much does it take for people to rise up, how much can they take before they get angry, how much can they take before the media is focusing on them. And all of those experiments, all of those weapons, the drones, the surveillance system, there's been a lot of talk for years about China's social credit scoring system. And it was seen as the end of times dystopia, kind of, that China would create its own God that surveils every human being and sees what is their mathematical score in terms of good doing or bad doing. Israel implemented this in Gaza with lethal consequences. They had this artificial intelligence system called Gospel that would scrap everything that you've ever done on the internet, public information. They would scrap all of this and private information that Israel monitors by basically virtue of being the provider of the internet to Palestinians in Gaza. And they would give all of this giant data to AI to analyze without any human element in it, and give each single person in Gaza a score. The score, let's say from 1 to 100. If your score above a certain level, then it's okay to murder you. Do you think that it's not going to come your way? And that is basically the way, the message that should be hammered over and over and over again moving forward, that everything that's been done to us. You have now David Ellison and Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison is the largest single donor to the IDF. They would hold all those fundraisings in the US for the IDF throughout its wars or assaults or genocide in Gaza. And Larry Ellison would usually be the largest individual donor to the IDF. At Oracle, he's a billionaire, second richest man in the world. And at Oracle, he literally told his staff, or his people told the staff, that if you are not loving Israel enough, you need to seek psychological help. You need to seek a psychiatric intervention. And that guy is now about to buy CNN with the entire universe that comes with it, the Warner Brother universe. He already bought Paramount, CBS, and now he's putting Barry Weiss in charge. Like, when that person that's so delighted about Israel's crimes against humanity in Gaza is buying most of the media, mainstream media in the US, and basically becoming in charge also of TikTok, becoming in charge of what Americans see and hear, do you think that that person will be kinder to you than he was to us? So that's basically it. The other thing about Palestinian recovery from this, we as Palestinians, we've been through a similar episode, although not as destructive as this one, but it included another destructive element, the mass expulsion. That was the Nakba. My grandfather, my entire family were kicked to Gaza 1948. Some of them even in 1949. Like, it took time for Israel to put people on trucks and send them at gunpoint. And they ended up in Gaza on sand beaches with nothing at all. Basically, the only thing that they got was a tent from the UN at the time, UNRWA. Before that, there was the Quakers, the American Friends Committee Service. They were there before UNRWA, and then you had UNRWA giving them tents. And they managed to make a living. They managed to thrive. Yesterday, you had the Nobel Committee declaring a Palestinian refugee to be the winner of the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. He grew up in a refugee camp in Amman without electricity, water. He was overcrowding with all of his siblings in a small room with their cattle, with the livestock that they had at home. And now he's a world-renowned scientist. You have the same kind of potential in Gaza. The only thing that is a major source of concern is, what does it take to rebuild people's souls and minds? Because the damage that's been done is beyond human imagination. And I've spoken to people whose families survived similar major apocalyptic events, genocides. So, for example, friends whose parents survived the Holocaust. And there's no guarantee what that kind of experience can turn you in. It's like a black box. It's a mystery. It can make people sometimes more pragmatic, more shrewd. It can make people more cynical. It can make people more pacifist, more humane, the spirit of never again. And it can make some people more brutal. So I heard it firsthand from people who would say that on the day that my grandfather or my father ended up in the concentration camps or in the death camps, that's when he realized there's no God, there's no humanity, there are no principles, everything is up for grabs, because the whole world failed them. And you have the entire failure of humanity repeating itself with Gaza now. You had all the heartwarming solidarity movements all around the world. And I think those movements are the crucial element of Gaza's healing, is to continue to show that solidarity, not necessarily with something major. It doesn't take too much. Like, there's the concept of microaggression. You can counter it with micro solidarity. After October 7th, I was terrified on walking on the streets of Europe, or in any European capital, or in Canada, etc., in any Western capital. I thought that I'm going to get killed if I am walking on the street looking basically brown and Muslim. And it took seeing people taking to the street in those demonstrations to reassure my personal safety. Every time I'm on the street and I see someone wearing a Palestinian kufiya, or a Palestinian necklace, or a watermelon necklace, or a watermelon earring, it warms my heart, not just sort of like the feeling of solidarity, but it's an assurance of my physical safety, that I have people around me who understand where I come from and who want me to exist. Because otherwise, the atmosphere that preceded October 7th is that the whole world turned their back on Palestinians, on Gaza in specific, and we were just doomed to languish and die without any noise, without any fuss about it. And after October 7th, it became even worse. The atmosphere there is that it's not only the whole world turning its back on us, but the whole world is joining forces to ensure our extermination. So you need this more than ever.
What you said there earlier, that warning, I think is just so important, and Hannah Arendt, many will be particularly familiar with her for coining the banality of evil, but she wrote about how the colonial violence of Europeans, the violence, the genocides that they perpetrated, committed against their colonized subjects, the architecture of repression that they constructed as they carved the world up between themselves, that was the precondition for Nazism and the horrors that Nazism and fascism inflicted on Europe. Because she said what happened is that dehumanization and those atrocities were then redirected back into Europe, having been exported. And we saw the horrific consequences. And that is a very, very grim warning, because we have seen in the West how the political and media elites have facilitated, justified, and whitewashed limitless barbarism, the most documented and confessed to crime as it happened in human history. We've seen before our eyes limitless depravity, and it has all been facilitated and justified by our rulers, by our media elite. And that, given the rise of fascism and the far right in the West, people should be very scared and vigilant. I just want to ask one final thing, if you don't mind me just asking this. And this is difficult to ask, but I think because it touches on that dehumanization of Palestinians that you just spoke about. And obviously dehumanization is the precondition of genocide. You have lost so many people yourself. And I say lost, these are not people who've died because of cancer or a natural disaster. They were exterminated in a genocide by the Israeli state, armed and backed by the West. And I just wondered if you could just end by just remembering some of the people, who you knew and you loved, who in the last 2 years have been killed by Israel. Just anything you want to say, any memories, any sense, any feelings, if you don't mind me asking you, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. The first person that always comes to mind is my father. The picture behind me is him as a child. And that was long before October 7th. It was when Israel first imposed its draconian siege on Gaza with the explicit goal of putting us on a starvation diet. He basically was killed by starvation and disease. And it was a very slow process to see it unfold, because it doesn't happen at once. You watch the entire thing. You're forced to watch it so powerlessly. And I've seen him. He was a genius. He was a medical doctor that instilled in me all the sort of principles, moral values that I carry with me until today. And to see this person that I respected so deeply, first of all, starve, turn into a skeleton, skin and bone, then very slowly losing his motor functions, he couldn't move, and then very slowly losing the ability to speak. And at the end of it, it's his eyes staring at the ceiling in terror, not getting any help whatsoever, until he passed away. And my thought at the time, I was only a child. I was about 12. My immediate thought was to go into my room and pray every night, please God, take me and not him. Let it be me, not him. Over and over and over again. And I didn't even get a chance to grieve him before Israel started turning us in Gaza into rats, carrying for food and shelter, because they started bombing us a couple of months after Operation Cast Lead. And ever since, I've never got a chance to process any of this, because every other year, there's another Israeli assault. Every year, there's another Israeli escalation, another bombardment, another loved one killed, either by the siege or by the Israeli massacres unfolding in Gaza. The second person that comes to mind is Ali Adam, my closest friend. He was killed literally while walking next to a hospital in Deir al-Balah, Al-Aqsa hospital. If he had just waited 1 minute at home, if he had just hugged his mother, if he had just like drank a cup of tea before leaving, that's all that makes the difference between living and dying in Gaza. It's very random, very arbitrary. And Ali, he was one of the brightest people that I've ever met. And the thing that devastates me the most about him, like I get asked, like, what would Ali have wanted? Would your father have wanted? And try to do this to make them proud. And the first thought that comes to mind, the only thing that Ali would have wanted is to be alive. And the most devastating thing about the death, the murder of my loved ones, one after the other, is basically each single one of them died before they ever got a chance to experience living. Most people in Gaza have never been out, never been allowed to step a foot outside. They've never seen an airport or a flight passenger. They've never met anybody from the outside world, not even from the West Bank, the other Palestinian half, or from Palestinians inside Israel. They've never seen a river or forests or jungles. It's basically a human cage. And that's the most devastating thing about it. And it should not be allowed to be.
Mohammed, it's always a huge honor and a huge privilege to talk to you. And especially as soon as I knew about the deal, the proposed ceasefire, whatever we want to call this. The first person, of course, I wanted to speak to was yourself. And you speak always so beautifully, so eloquently, but so full of, limitless knowledge, detail, all the rest of it. We're very lucky to have you. And you talk about doing people proud, but you've certainly done your people proud during the most unimaginably horrific period that the Palestinian people have suffered, despite the horrors that the Palestinian people have already suffered throughout their history. So for those watching, do share the video, press like, subscribe, leave your comments. That's good for engagement. Obviously, we want people to listen to what Mohammed had to say. But as ever, all my love and solidarity, and thank you so much.
Thank you as well, Owen. I appreciate it.